interesting. So some of this evidence goes to returns, but some of it I do think is looking at the people who are contributing to the fund and viewing themselves as a vehicle of advancing the interests of people who are contributing to the fund, and that's how they view their mission. At least some of them, we know, like New York City and some others. I think that's part of that story. I'm glad that some of these other questions. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Asaf. So Asaf, and also loops back to something that I would have mentioned before. I'm glad to have the opportunity to address it. What we have here, and this is a project I've been thinking about working on for a while, which is what we have is a fascinating mismatch of fiduciary duties. On the one hand, we have the investee fiduciary duties, which are governed by corporate law and cite some of the things you just mentioned. On the other hand, we have the investor, my investor in this context, fiduciary duties, which come from ERISA, state pension codes, and trust law. These things are not the same. We might ask the question, and they're cousins, by the way, trust law and corporate law. Corporate law comes from trust law. We ought to be potentially asking the question, is it still justifiable to have two different regimes of fiduciary duty for these two entities that once looked very different from each other? But today, a CalPERS looks a lot more like a Fortune 500 public company than the trust that was created by the wealthy business person to take care of his or her children who wanted to do something else with their lives, right? I mean, these are the legal structures in place. Should they be so different from each other? Because the language under ERISA, to come back to your point, because you were saying, oh, if you look at Delaware, it says, well, the language under ERISA says that trustees have to invest, quote, solely in the interests of participants and beneficiaries and for the exclusive purpose of providing benefits. And that exact language is echoed in dozens of states, solely in the interests of participants and beneficiaries. That's not the entity. What has happened is that, maybe I won't name names now, but some have really lobbied hard the Department of Labor to force an entity interpretation of that language that I just read to say, no, your duty runs to the trust, to the fund, not to the workers. Well, that reads those words, participants and beneficiaries, right out of the statute. So we may have a real conflict here between what are the duties of the investors, what are the duties of the investees, should we think about harmonizing them. Finally, there's the point about the big three. Great points, both Nitzan and Kobe. Totally true. Look, a couple points here. One is I try to argue that I think that to some extent, the index funds are the biggest and they're the most important, but they'll never be cutting edge. And I think they're too disabled. They're too disabled by some of these business conflicts, only some of which I mentioned, to be quite as on the, I was going to say on the vanguard, but that could get confusing, at the cutting edge in the way that like the public pension funds and the labor union funds, who don't have investment analysts who are calling up the CFO and trying to get a quick peek on what the earnings per share results are going to be, or don't have their own 401k platforms, or and so on and so forth. And so the relationship between the pension funds and the index funds is interesting. BlackRock, or Stone in the Rock, BlackRock has never filed a shareholder proposal. Never, right? I mean, but they have shown some willingness to back. So there is a role allocation that goes on here. And it's definitely worth exploring more, but I still think that there's a role for these entities, even in the public company space. Why don't I end it there? Thank you so much. I really